Hello there, real estate and architectural photographers. In this video, I'm going to share with you how we can take a photograph with blown out highlights and shadows without detail, and through some game-changing tools inside of Photoshop, we're going to bring back all of that lovely dynamic range. We're going to improve the contrast. We're going to take care of the color casts and add some lovely detail too. So let's get into it. I've put this video together for the architectural photographers and the real estate photographers out there. You guys may recall a video I did recently where I shared how to bring back the highlights and the shadow detail in photos like this from multiple exposures. And I did that all manually in Photoshop, and yes, absolutely you can do it that way, but I've got a better way to share with you today. And before I get into the edit itself, let me just share with you this project and also share with you a good model for pricing your work as well. You can see that I've got 21 photographs here in this folder, and they are pretty much overall shots. There's some interiors and some staircases, some evening shots. Anyway, these were all licensed to the builder. They paid me for the photo shoot itself, so my time on site and capturing the work, and then they're also paying me a per image fee. I'm licensing these photos out to them for their full use for whatever they want to do, but the key benefit of licensing the work just to that client means that you're not opening up a home or architecture magazine and suddenly seeing your photographs used by a third party. Prior to me using that system, that used to happen a lot. So I've managed to leverage this pricing structure and actually earn more from this job. So for example, this photograph here showing the louvers above the deck area here, rather than the louver company getting these photos from the builder, they've had to come to me and actually say, we would like to license this photograph and a couple of others, and then they need to pay me a license as well. So you're able to get paid multiple times over by the builder, the architect, the designer, the louver company, the kitchen benchtop manufacturer, whoever. You keep control of the photos that you've taken and you can be remunerated accordingly. So a job that initially might be a couple of $1,000s suddenly becomes several $1,000s. If you guys want to know more about the business side of things and how I price work, just write pricing in the comments below and I'll see if I can put a video together for you if there's enough interest out there. What I want to share with you in this video is a couple of really useful tools that can help you bring together several different exposures into one and then get the photo looking great to get back to the client. Right, let's get into it. This is one of the photographs that has been selected by the louver company. And as you can see, the initial raw photo has a lot of issues with it. But probably the most notable issue that we would need to fix is the fact that we have such an extreme contrast in this photo. The blacks are such a deep black and the sky outside is bleached out completely. So that's why when I'm on site, I actually shoot a bracketed set of pretty much all my architectural shots. Whether or not I'm using a strobe to light the interior, I will still shoot a bracketed set of 5 images. And oftentimes that's all I need to create my finished photo. So I'll have my base exposure, I'll have a darker exposure, I'll have one even darker still, so we've got all of that detail outside the window. We've got a brighter exposure that would work quite nicely for the interior. Then we've got an even brighter exposure still, which will help us bring out detail in those very deep shadow areas. The first thing we want to do is select the photos that we want to go towards the finished set. I like to work with a solid base layer, something that's going to recover the shadows and something to bring back the highlights. Sometimes you can get away with a good base layer and then just an image to bring back the highlights. But in this case, because we have those blown out highlights and we have this very dark area here, we're going to need the 3 photos. So I'm going to select this one here as my base exposure. Well, now I'm going to select all the photos and I'm going to turn on auto syncing. So the corrections that I apply to this particular photo will be applied across the board. So the editing that you're going to do in Lightroom comes down to 2 passes. The first pass is universal and will apply to all of the photos. The second pass is done on an individual photo basis, and that will get each photo ready for the blending process. So first of all, we'll lay the foundations with some generic editing. I'll show you what I turn on inside of Lightroom to make sure the files are looking pretty good to start with. And then once I've shown you that, you'll be able to save that as your own preset. So the first thing we want to do is come to a camera matching profile. And we want to choose the most neutral or flat profile that we have. So camera flat is the perfect one for me. The profiles you have available to you will be dependent on the camera model that you're using. The next thing we want to do is get a white balance that's consistent across all the photos. So we can select an area that we want to be the neutral grey point, and we may want to tweak that. Any of these changes here will be specific to the individual file, so I'll leave those for now. I may add just a smidge of clarity, and I'm going to bring the saturation up because by applying that flat profile, things get a little washed out and desaturated. One of the most important things on this foundation pass is to come into the lens correction, turn on chromatic aberration removal, and enable the profile corrections. And as I toggle that off and on, you'll see that the barrel distortion that my lens has at that wide 16mm end, that is removed straight away. So that's really nice. And the next thing you should do is come into the transform section, and you don't want to save this into your preset because this is going to be unique to every photo, but you need to do this before you take your photos into Photoshop for that blending process. We're going to come to the guided section, and basically you're just going to draw two guides, one on the right hand side and get that line running parallel to your verticals, and then come over to this side and you can do the same over here on this side. I'm just temporarily going to boost the exposure up just so that I can check with that line on the edge of the TV that we're nice and straight. Yeah, I'll go with that. Double click the exposure to reset it. And now I'm going to select which frames I want to use in Photoshop for the blend. So I'm going to deselect all the photos. And this is probably the best middle exposure, but what I want to do is make more of the interior. And in this particular frame, it's quite dark. So I'm going to go to one that's slightly brighter. And now just keeping my eye on sort of the mid-tones of this photo, I'm going to make some adjustments. This shape that I've made here by dropping the highlights, boosting the shadows and whites and dropping the blacks is a pretty common starting point for me when I'm editing my photos. If there's anything that you're doing time and time again with your editing, you want to save that into your initial preset. I am just going to synchronize those changes across those photos. I'm going to select this one and press the P key on the keyboard to pick it. To deal with the shadows, I'm obviously going to need a brighter exposure. So that would be this one here, which was shot at a 15th of a second. So we're one stop brighter. And then I'll want a photo that's going to deal with the highlights. And with its exposure set to 0, this one's looking pretty good because nothing's bleached out. We've got all the detail in the cloud here. Everything's getting very dark on the interior, but we don't worry about that because that's where our exposure blending comes in, and we're going to be taking the best bit from each of these photos. So far we're going to have the highlights from this photo. We're going to be using this one as a base exposure, and then we're going to be using this photo to bring up the shadow detail in here. Now we're going to be opening these as smart objects in Photoshop, so we can come back in and play with any of these settings at any time. But prior to going into Photoshop, this is what I would recommend you do. The photo that you're wanting to represent the shadows, so this one here, to get a better blend, what you want to do is bring the highlights down and bring the whites down. Conversely, the photo that you're wanting to bring the detail of the highlights in, for this photo, what you want to do is boost the shadows up and also the blacks up. So by doing that, you're not really affecting the key area that we were concerned about, in this case, the exterior, the highlight area. But by boosting the shadows and the blacks, it's going to make our blend much more seamless and much more believable. We're pretty much good to go, but I'm just going to make a couple of little adjustments just to get things fine-tuned exactly how I want them. If your blacks are extremely dark, what you can do is actually drop the contrast to the left, and that will actually bring out more detail in those dark shadows. And that works particularly well when you're dealing with a profile that is flat. You're not able to bring back quite as much detail in those deep shadows if you're using something that's much more vivid and punchy. I would still like to have a pure black point though, so just so that I can see when I'm hitting black, I'm going to turn on this little icon in the top left of the histogram here. And that's just going to give me a warning of blue when I actually hit pure black. So now I have my 3 files ready. All I'm going to do is select them all, right click, come to edit in, and I'm going to open them as smart objects in Photoshop. So we have our 3 photos open now. So I'm just going to break them away from the top here. I'm going to press V to get my move tool, and then I'm just going to hold the shift key while I drag the photos into one file, one on top of the other. And now we can redock this version. And if we come to our layers, we can see that we have 3 different versions. And I think it's a really good idea to stay organized and rename these. So this version recovers our highlights. This layer is for our shadows. And that layer is our base. I like to bring my highlights back first and worry about the shadows afterwards. I think the highlights are more important in making the photo look good. So effectively what we're trying to do here is recover the area that is completely blown out. We want to bring back all the lovely detail that exists in this highlights layer and combine that with this layer here, but we don't want it to affect any of the interior because as you can see in this particular file, the interior is starting to look very muddy and washed out, whereas this interior is brighter and more vibrant. In previous videos, I've shown you how to do this manually, and let me quickly show you how to do that again, and then I'll show you what I found to be a much better way and a massive time saver. So, the manual way, come down, add a mask, come over, image, we're going to come to apply image, we're going to choose our layer to be the base layer, and we're going to have the blending mode as multiply. We click OK, and bada bing, bada bong, just like that, we have recovered our highlights. How cool is that? And the mask that we've created is super detailed. And here it is. If I alt click on the actual mask itself, you see it, and we can make further adjustments to that mask. But that generic apply image mask that we've created is not as good and it's not as accurate as it could be. So let me delete this and I'll show you a better way. So I'll hide that so that we can just see the base layer because this is what we want to use to create the mask because it's these bright areas that we're wanting to put the highlights into. And those of you who are familiar with Photoshop will realize that this is not a normal Adobe Photoshop panel. It looks pretty scary and daunting, but honestly, it's really not. It's a huge time saver for me. So I'm going to show you just one aspect, but a hugely important aspect of this panel. And if you guys are doing a lot of architectural or real estate photography and you want to do this type of exposure blending, I would seriously recommend it. So I'll put a link to it in the description below. Let me show you what it does. We can just press L1 and just like that we've created a really nice luminosity mask. But what if we wanted something that's just honed in a little tighter on those highlights? Well, we can press L2 or L3 for example, and look at that, we're now isolating those highlights even more. We could go to L2 and let a little bit more of these highlights in. But as you know from that highlights layer that we have here, things in the interior are pretty muddy. So we don't want to be going for something as broad as this in our mask because anywhere where it's white or light grey, it's going to be letting through whatever's on that layer. So we want a tighter, more bespoke mask. So this L2 could be perfect. And if you're happy with how this looks, all you need to do is select the layer that you want to put that mask onto and just simply click mask. Now if I turn this layer on, we can see that we have perfectly masked in that sky. We've got the grass back. This is our before, this is our after. Look at that precision. If I show you this mask again, we could come in and we could use any of our tools within inside of Photoshop to refine this mask. Or what I prefer to do is leave this mask alone, seeing as it's there as a really precise detailed mask. And what we're going to do is create a group that we can put this layer into. Now why would we do that? Well, the big benefit of this is we can add another mask to this group. And if I invert this mask by pressing Ctrl I, what I'm able to do now is come in and paint with precision exactly where I want to reintroduce what's going on outside. Now I call that double masking and it's a really effective technique. It enables us to have this precision mask and then we can paint things in with a garbage mask. Just something that's really quick, really rough. So just like that, we've gone from this to this, and if you're anything like me, at some point when you were just getting started out, maybe you're still doing that now, you've actually come in and tried to manually mask around these items, paint things in, whereas we can use that mask to literally bring it in with absolute perfection. The fact that things are looking a little flat at the moment, I'm not worried about at all because I can bring back all of our lovely contrast and everything once we have the correct dynamic range in our photo. So now you've got the principle of how that works. Let me show you this panel in action again to deal with these dark shadows here. So just like we have the ability to select our mask based on our light values, we also have the ability to select the mask based on our dark values. So for example, if I press D here, this is the broadest selection of the shadows that you can make. And as you come down to these tighter, smaller D numbers, things get more and more refined. So I don't want to be super precise. I want to keep a nice soft sort of feathering out from this area. So in this case, I think I'm going to go with D3. I select the layer that I want to apply this to and I just click mask. And now when I turn this layer on, we should see the recovery of all this shadow detail over here. And there you go. If I turn this off and on and just toggle between it, you'll see that shadow detail being recovered over here. But you'll also notice something else. We're getting the rest of these areas over on the right hand side just getting washed out as I reintroduce this. And obviously that's not what we want, so that's where this technique of double masking comes in. We create a new group that we can drop this layer into, and now we can apply a separate mask to the group that houses this layer. So another mask goes on top, make sure it's black to start with, and now with a white paintbrush we can just paint in the shadows exactly where we want them. And if I want to crank the opacity up and get this job done a little quicker, I'll just go there, do that. Maybe introduce a little bit over the carpet, maybe a tiny bit on the ceiling just to brighten that up. And again, on the right hand side, you can see my nasty looking mask here. I can be so loose painting that in, yet when you see what it's doing, it's revealing those shadows with precision. The guy who makes this panel sells it on its own, and he also sells it with some training as well. For me to buy the panel and the training all together cost less than the $115 photo license that I'm charging my client. So if you work in real estate photography or architectural photography, I would thoroughly recommend this panel. I'm using it on a daily basis for doing these exposure blends, and I'm also using it in my landscape photography as well. So for me, it's been a brilliant investment. Before I move on to just finishing this photo off, let's have a quick look at our before and our after. Look at that initial photo. We've got contrast that the camera just can't handle. Turn those layers back on, and we've got the foundations of a scene that was much more akin to what our human eye is able to see when we're there present on site. Okay, let's group those together, and I'll just show you my finishing process, and I've got one more really useful tool to show you as well. Before I go any further with my post-processing, what I like to do is just retouch the photo. So if I see little areas that are just catching my eye, I come in with a spot healing brush tool and I just tidy them up. And sometimes that's sensor dust on my camera or funny little anomalies like that on the ceiling. And in this case, we have a reflection of my camera. Sometimes this tool does a good job, and sometimes it does what it's doing there, which is creating a bit of a nasty mess. I'm not going to worry too much about cleaning this up. It exists in the reflection in the TV, and as long as you can't see that that's a tripod with a camera on it there, I'm not going to worry too much. If we wanted to, what we could come along and do is grab the patch tool, make a big selection through there, through that dirty area, and then just drag and sample from a smooth area. And now we have a much nicer smooth gradient on that. Okay, I don't think I need to do too much more on that retouch. So among other things I need to address, the three key things I'm thinking of are the discoloration of the ceiling from reflected bounce light coming up with color casts on it. I want to reintroduce a bit of punch and contrast into the image. And because we exported from Lightroom without any sharpening, we also need to address that as well. We could use tools inside of Lightroom, but in this video I'm trying to share with you a few tools that can help with efficiency of editing. From a good base state like this, I'll often be taking my photo nowadays into Luminar AI and doing my retouching there because I've got recipes that I've saved that basically leverage all of the AI. That means I don't have to do any of the retouching. Luminar's doing it for me. Export the photo, jobs are good. And if you don't have Luminar AI, I've got a link in the description below for that too. But I'm going to show you something different today. We're going to take a look at Color Effects Pro. I've been using this tool set for years. It's phenomenal. So come down to Nik Collection. And in here, we've got some of my favorite plugins. One of them that we're not going to look at today, but Silver Effects Pro, if you're into black and white photography. This is the absolute daddy Mac of black and white photo editing. So I strongly recommend getting this because that comes with Silver Effects Pro. But today we're going to look at Color Effects Pro 4. And then once we've done our changes there, we're going to do our sharpening with the output sharpener. Again, a really, really powerful tool that is way better than what we have inside of Photoshop. So let's open up Color Effects Pro 4. And just like that, it remembers my last recipe that I had. So what I'm going to do is just turn these off and show you what each of these does individually. So we have the detail extractor. Let me turn this on. And you can see straight away, everything just gets a little bit more punchy, gets a little bit more detail. I only have this set to 6% for my particular recipe that I've created, but if I crank this up, you'll see the effect that it's doing. It's basically looking for areas of detail and enhancing them. if I compare our before and our after, you can see that a bit of really useful detail is being added, and I found that architects and designers really like that. The next tool on the list is probably my favorite, and this is Pro Contrast. And just with my 7 and 27% settings dialed in here, let me turn this on and turn it off. See that? Let's just do our quick compare. Without it, with it, without it, with it. I really love that. If we look at the individual sliders and what they do, if I grab the correct contrast slider and push that up, you can see that that one's more of a global overall correction of contrast. But I find this particular slider quite aggressive. You can see how we're bleaching out all of that detail that we worked hard to bring back in. So I never push that one too far. But dynamic contrast, this is the one I really love. Watch this. As I push this one up, I'll push it really high so you can see. Basically 100%, we haven't blown out anything. This is dynamically adapting the contrast in our scene whilst preserving the highlights and the shadows, which ties in so nicely with what we were doing earlier when we were blending those exposures together. Let's look at our before and our after. We're bringing back all of that contrast, but we're not bleaching anything out and we're not muddying our blacks. 100% is far too strong, and I normally dial it in somewhere around sort of 25, something like that. Because the output from this creates a new layer for us inside of Photoshop, what we can do if we want is to be a little bit more aggressive with these sliders, and then we can apply a mask inside of Photoshop and just paint it back in with a higher opacity where we want it to show up more. There's heaps of other tools inside of here, and the Detail Extractor and Pro Contrast are both available in the Architecture library. But crazily, the next two that I've applied here are available from the Portrait section. So although they don't reside within the Architecture filter library, I actually find they work really well for architecture. So high key, that normally helps to neutralize some of these color tones. So if I turn that on, it's pushing those brighter areas just towards more of a pure white. So again, off and on. And I really like adding the glamour glow as a final step as well, because by adding the detail extractor and also that localized contrast as well, the edges and the structure of everything is getting very defined. What the glamour glow filter does is actually kind of soften things off. So if I turn that on, we've only got it at 15% at the moment. So again, I'm doing everything with subtlety. But if I push it all the way up, you'll see what it's doing. It's giving us a nice bit of contrast in there, but also softening stuff up as well. It's doing a similar thing to the mystical filter inside of Luminar AI, and you guys who follow my channel will know I quite like that one. So this is doing a similar thing. It's just softening things up, but it's doing it in an aesthetically pleasing way to my eye. You guys might not like it, but yeah, I'm a fan. So let's look at our before and our after. Look at that. Before and after, we've suddenly got all of our contrast back. We've got a nice punch to the image, and what we can do is click OK, and it's loaded back into Photoshop as a layer. So this is with it off, this is with it on, and now what we can do is just mask that layer, get our white paintbrush again, maybe this time set that around sort of 50%, click, and just start painting this in where we want it. So I'll do one pass through the middle, do a second pass, and now I'm just going to reduce the opacity a little bit, and now sort of sweep over the whole photo, just so I'm getting some of that effect in around the edges. So here's our before, here's our after, and if you decide it's still a bit too much, you can make adjustments to your mask, as I'm going to go and do here, and just reduce the effect by painting black around the edges, or what you could do is just reduce the overall opacity. Now I did forget about the ceiling, didn't I? So we have a color cast there. So yes, I could correct that using Photoshop's tools, but in this case what I'm going to do is again use Nik Collection's Color Effects Pro 4. And I'm going to delete these settings that we had from last time. And I'm going to come over to the architecture section, and we have a tool to remove color cast, and we also have a white neutralizer. I'm going to go with the white neutralizer, and I'm going to get the color sampler here and just click on the ceiling there. And we have the ability to neutralize the whites, take it away, and just put this where we want it. And we can either use Photoshop to mask this back in, or what we can do inside of Color Effects Pro, they have their own way of controlling an effect. So what you can actually do is add a control point. And wherever you put these control points, that is going to affect only that area. And what you can do is just hold the Alt key and actually create more of these along the ceiling itself. And that's a really quick way just to neutralize a ceiling. I'll click OK and that'll be loaded back into Photoshop. And if I toggle this layer off and on, you'll see that that neutralization is only going on in the ceiling thanks to those little adjustment points that we added. Again, we can control the opacity, so we may not want to neutralize it completely. We may just want around 80%, 75%, something like that, just to keep the believability of the light that would have been picking up a bit of color off the floor and bouncing up to the ceiling. If we're happy with how the photo's looking, we can add some sharpening, get it saved, get it back to the client and get paid. So let's come down to Nik Collection, and this time I'm going to go to Output Sharpener. Sharpener Pro 3 is an absolute beast for sharpening. We've got this little navigator here, and if we move it down so that we're looking at something of more importance, like this table here, we can grab the hand tool and we can slide this back and forth so that we can see our before and then reveal the after, and we're getting some lovely sharpening going on there. I'm aware this video is getting away on us just a little bit, so I won't go into detail on all of these, but you have great sharpening tools such as adaptive sharpening. We can sharpen the actual structure itself. We can add local contrast sharpening, and we can do focus sharpening as well. And it really is cool because if you actually wanted to, you can actually use this tool creatively to reduce focus as well. But in this case, we just want to increase our sharpening. So rather than a before and after, I actually prefer to look at the whole screen at once and just toggle the preview off and on, and as you can see, we really are enhancing that sharpening. When you get the hang of these really easy sliders and you get it set up the way you want, it really is so much better than Photoshop's inbuilt sharpening tools. We can jump to a different area, have a quick look at the before and after, and if we're happy with that, we just click OK. There we go, and now we have a sharpening layer, and if we want, we could actually just paint that in exactly where we want it if we wanted to use a mask. So this is our before, this is our after. That's a really nice bit of sharpening we've got going on. But my absolute favorite part of the whole process, the really satisfying thing to do, is to drop down to our absolute starting point, the base layer, and we can look at our before and our after. Here's our before, bleached out, blown out highlights, shadows that you can barely see into, color cast in the ceiling, and then bammo, there we go. We've got a lovely file that we can send back to our client and get paid. I really hope this video has been helpful to you guys, and hopefully seeing how easy it is to do that exposure blending with that panel has been beneficial. And then finishing things with those tools inside of Nik Collection really can elevate your work to the next level. And if you're doing real estate photography or architecture photography on a regular basis, it's well worth investing in these kind of tools that can help you achieve better results and do it much quicker than you can doing it natively inside of Photoshop. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Don't forget, I've got links to all of this stuff in the description below, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye for now.